Professor Amitav wrote a book that is hanging in the air of time, and that is the world order. And the question here is whether the West is in decline to the extent that, in all likelihood, it'll be the rest against the West, and it'll eventually mean that the West will stop being the dominant power or even not be a power at all. Professor Amitav's book has a strong focus on history. It doesn't only talk about what's happening now and what may happen in the future, but in the book he goes back to the world order from the times, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, Professor, from the times of the Summers, India, Greece, the Mesoamerican empires, the medieval caliphates, and of course what he refers to as the Eurasian empires, to refer to not only the European empires but also the Asian empires. Back in the day, our empires coincided with the Turkish Empire. It wasn't a European, but it was a nearby empire, a complicated neighbor of ours, I may say. So Professor Amitav tries explaining how the world order was established by the dominant power, and that is why he says once and in the future, the once and future world order. And that's the important thesis. Why global civilization will survive the decline of the West. So he's assuming the decline of the West, and he's also giving for granted that this decadence or decline in the West will not lead to the disappearance of global civilization. It'll survive, but let's listen to how global civilization will survive. Will it continue being a Western civilization? This is a title for discussion. It's an ambiguous title, and in the book it is recognized that since the dawn of this century, or before even, the West is in a crisis. We are faced with social unrest, political polarization, and that other large powers have grown, especially China, and that these new powers are threatening to wipe away the Western hegemony and lead the future world order. Others believe that that won't lead to a world order, but to a world chaos, as happened when the Roman Empire collapsed. The Roman Empire collapsed and no one took over, but we entered the era of feudal wars and broken up political struggles and a permanent conflict without anyone emerging to put order. Order is imposed through rules and also through strength, because law without strength doesn't usually build an order, only in theory at least. So in this book that is part of the cycle of conferences organized by CIDOB on peace and war, which we had last Saturday. So this conference today is part of this series, and these are the questions put across by the author. He started off with the Summers and ends with us highlighting the human values, economic interdependency, the rules governing interstate conduct. They have evolved over the millennia, and history suggests that this order will endure even as the West may not be at the helm. So that's why not everything is so clear. There may be the hegemonic power. When it disappears, it may lead to chaos and anarchy. And that wouldn't be the first time it happens in world history. But according to the author, the West should read and learn from their history and to cooperate with the rest, in a capital R, to forge a more equitable order. If the Western order is being contested and people are calling for a new world order, it's probably because a large chunk of the world doesn't consider the current world order to be equitable. I'd like to insist that this is a series of the conferences Where is the World Headed, and with the presence of Professor Amitav and Inés Arco, who is a fellow researcher from here on Asia Pacific. And we also have Lluís Pellicer, who will be the moderator. He's a journalist from El País, and I'm sure this evening will be very interesting. Professor, the floor is yours.
I can take out the translation now for the time being. Okay. Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be not only to give a talk here, but also to be introduced by the former High Representative of, and the Vice President of the European Union and High Representative of, for Foreign Affairs of the European Union. And also for your very kind and gracious words. So I'm going to talk a little bit, like 10 minutes, 12 minutes about the key points of the book. This is not like a summary of the book. The book is, of course, available. It'll be available in Spanish in a month's time. The publisher, Spanish publisher, is right here in the audience. And it's actually going to be published from Barcelona. But I'm trying to give you a sense of what are the lessons of the book for contemporary issues, the issues that are most debated today in world order. This is a book that covers 5,000 years. You can see from beginning Sumerians to the Americans and the rest of the world. It's covered. It's not just about empires or big powers. It's also about societies and civilizations. Like, for example, the chapter on Islam, there is no one single Islamic empire. There are many empires, but also societies. When I deal with China and India and also the Americas, the pre-Columbus Americas, South and North America, they're not just about empires. There's also about societies and civilizations. So it is a very large history, large scope history book. And there are a lot of generalizations that if I was writing about one country or one empire, that would be much easier to explain everything. But I skip some parts of the story. But I think I put together what is arguably the first history of world order, not of history of the world, but history of world order. The other books you may have on this subject, like Henry Kissinger's World Order, doesn't talk about Africa, for example, doesn't talk about the Americas. I try to cover as many, about 10 major civilizations all over the world. Every region, every part of period of history is covered. So out of this, what are the lessons I draw for today's world? And that's what I'm going to focus. A few days ago, I gave a lecture in another university, in Honolulu University, that I talked about 40 minutes for covering a lot of the themes of this area, of this book. But today, let's start with this. Okay, I have to hold it for 10 minutes. Oh. So there is only really one key argument. If you want to, there are many arguments, but one that is more important than anything else. That world order, which is broadly defined as creating stability and dispelling chaos. This is the Egyptian formulation. The Egyptians talked about Maat and Isfet about 5,000 years ago. And that idea of creating stability, dispelling chaos has reproduced itself through every civilization. Persia, China, India, Christianity, Islam, and the Aztecs talked about chaos versus order, and also the Americans talking about maintaining global order, dispelling chaos from the global south, Soviet, Russians or Chinese or Iranians. So this is a very common persistent theme. But how do you do that? The ideas, the institutions, the norms, principles, the processes that you need to maintain that stability in a large part of the world. You cannot do it for the whole world. There is no such thing as a global order. Even the British Empire could not conquer Europe, for example. The American world order, very expansive, projecting power all over the world, but still, in its heydays during the Cold War, could not control Soviet Union or even the non-aligned countries like India or outside of it. So that's a big part of the world for a given period of time. You cannot have no world order is permanent. They rise and fall just like empires and nation states. So that's sort of an idea of world order and the idea institutions and mechanisms that are needed to create that world order. These are not the monopoly of any single civilization or nation. And I'm talking about ideas, just some example. Empire is one form of this, but also independence of states, like the Westphalian system, the anarchic system, Sumerian system, Mayan system, that order is best maintained not by empire, but also by a system of independent states, the Greek city-states. And then diplomacy, making peace treaties, free trade, we call it free trade, I call it open trade. The idea that trade is a common good and everybody should be allowed to trade, and the highways of trade, like the open seas, for example, oceans and seas, especially oceans, are, they belong to no particular country but are open to all. This is a principle that's being tested today. And so openness of commerce and openness of the seas. And humanitarian values, protecting people at the time of war, like the Geneva Convention kind of principles, but also forms of human rights, protecting human life, protecting civilians against cruel and unjust punishment, and many more. These ideas were not invented in one place by one country or one civilization. By looking at this almost a dozen civilizations in multiple periods of time, I find that there are resonance, there are echoes, there are origins, roots of these ideas in almost every civilization. We just ignore it. We just think everybody is so different from each other, which is true to some extent. But the ideas that underpin political order are not exclusive to one civilization. Some civilizations may do more for one idea and less for other idea, but they are distributed. And sometimes they do it independent of each other, and sometimes they learn from each other. Civilizations always learn from each other. No civilization has advanced without learning from others. This is a law of history that Braudel, the French historian Braudel, first pointed out, and I find plenty of evidence of this throughout history. So with that, there are 3 lessons of my book. There are many, many lessons, but 3 that are very important because we are talking about it every day today. As the American-dominated world order, some people call it liberal world order, or the Western-dominated world order declines, so we call the American world order as either unipolar or a liberal hegemonic order. So there's a lot of fear that without a single hegemonic power, all chaos will break out. So the Roman Empire analogy, but also very much talked about in the context of not just the decline of the US, but the abandonment by the US of the order that it helped build. So my argument is that whether US is a declining country or power is open to debate. The jury is out on that one. But there's no question about the order that it built. There's a difference between declining power of a country and the order that country committed itself to. And the United States has given up on that order. It was already eroding, but the US now under Trump basically decided to kill it. So that is creating fear that all hell will break loose because there is a long-standing assumption that only a great power, only a superpower, only a hegemon can create a stable world order. And that goes back to, it's not just a Western thing, by the way. It goes back to the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Romans, and the like. But I find also evidence that multipolar systems, a world of several powers, need not be unstable. There have been many cases where order and stability has been maintained very well if certain conditions are met, and they're not necessarily difficult to attain or impossible to attain. That's one example. Another argument. Second argument is that you don't need a hegemon to maintain open trading systems. And there is more evidence of this. We find over 1,000 years of history of the Indian Ocean, which is the largest oceanic trade system in the world before the transatlantic trade or the trans-Pacific trade emerged. And that trade was open, but not managed by one single hegemonic power. And the third argument is that humanitarian values are not peculiarly modern or Western. They are not. And let me just give you quick examples, and then I will finish. So this is a case study that I like to talk about. The first one is the 1400 BC, the 15th century BC. You have 5 great powers in the Near East: Egypt, Hatti, Mitanni, Assyria, Babylonia. And they're called Amarna powers because their correspondence is preserved or found in a place called Amarna, the Egyptian capital of the Egyptian New Dynasty for a period. And it's all available. You can read it, I mean, if you can, in translation. Then we have the European Concert of Powers after the defeat of Napoleon, Congress of Vienna, also a kind of multipolar system, but a coordinated system. Now, both kept peace, but you know, the important point is that the Amarna powers kept peace for 200 years. The European Concert kept peace maybe 50 years, from 1815 to the Crimean War, but maybe 100 years until the First World War. Why they did that? The key is diplomacy and communication. There was diplomacy in the Amarna system. We have records of it: gift-giving, reciprocity, understanding, and communication. A sense of brotherhood in some way. They call Amarna brotherhood. And the concert system was more transactional, but nonetheless, there was a commonality of among the great powers, the victorious great powers after the Napoleonic Wars, to preserve stability. So the moral of the story is that you can have a multipolar system and still maintain peace. And it's not inevitable that the collapse of a hegemonic order will lead to chaos. Now, I'm not advocating multipolarity. I like the term multiplexity, a multiplex world. I can talk about it. But multiplex is not just about great powers or military economic power balancing. It's also about interdependence, communication, ideas, norms, and interactions. So, but nonetheless, you don't have to always assume that the end of the American hegemony will lead to chaos because we have a bunch of great powers running around. The freedom of the seas. This is a kind of economic, what we call economic interdependence, free trade, but the basic principle is freedom of the seas. So the best example, as I mentioned, will be the Indian Ocean, the largest oceanic trading system in the world, managed not by any single empire, but a bunch of small port city-states from East African coast, Malindi, Mombasa, Mogadishu, then going to the Gulf area. Hormuz is part of it, a little kingdom there, and Aden, then Indian Calicut, and on the east coast, Masaliputam and Malacca. Trade flourished because the evidence we have is that from a Portuguese visitor, Tomé Pires, who went to Malacca just after Malacca fell to the Portuguese, that whoever is lord in Malacca has his hand in the throat of Venice. So much prosperity came from the spice trade, supplying to Venice and other European destinations. So it was not, it was free, open, and it was wealth creating. It was not managed by an empire. And in fact, it was so prosperous that that's what became the main reason for the Portuguese to conquer Malacca, because they could not only control the spice trade, but also deny that to the Muslims, to the Arab empires in Egypt and the Middle East. So freedom of the seas, when it was challenged by the Dutch ousted the Portuguese, took over Indonesian spice islands, and try to do exactly the same thing, create a monopoly, and not let the sultanates trade among themselves. And the Sultan of Goa, now in Sulawesi, in Indonesia, said that God created land and the sea. The land he divided among men, the sea he gave in common. It has never been heard that anyone should be forbidden to sell the seas. Asian countries did not have a tradition of extending their jurisdiction to the sea. Jurisdiction ended with land. The sea belonged to everybody. And that facilitated trade. It was rules-based. There is a law, code of law in Malacca still, called Undang-Undang Laut Malacca, Maritime Laws of Malacca, that laid out very transparently what are the rules of trade. The committee of 10 merchants, not the government officials, decided disputes and set tariff rates and did arbitration. It is rules-based written maritime order. So again, that idea of open trading, I don't call it free trade, that's a modern term, but open trading. There were more than 80 nationalities in Malacca. Some 87 languages are spoken. So you can have that without a hegemon. You can have that based on rules that are transparent, predictable, and not written by governments, but by the merchants themselves. And finally, humanitarian values. Now, you know the Geneva Convention. Now we have the United States talking about not following any humanitarian law, just do whatever it likes in Iran, for example. And the Geneva Convention are supposed to protect you from that. So Geneva Conventions protect civilians, those who are wounded, those who have surrendered, or those who are sick. But the Code of Manu in ancient India, around the 1st century AD, did that and much more. So you can look at the translation that when he fights, means the warrior, when the warrior fights in battle, let him not strike, who join his hands in supplication and surrender, who sits down, who says, I am thine, means I'm yours, who sleeps, who is disarmed, who looks on without taking part in the fight, like civilians, whose weapons are broken, who has been grievously wounded, who is in fear, who is just afraid, who is torn to flight. Also banned poisonous weapons, chemical weapons. And these were actually followed. These are not rhetoric. This is a legal code. And the legal code, why was it proclaimed? Not because India is a peaceful country. No country is entirely peaceful. There are plenty of violence in India. But it was precisely to address that violence. There are so many people would be dying otherwise if we don't have such a rules. So the lawgivers actually created these rules, and they were obeyed. There are plenty of evidence, not only in this code, but also Indian scriptures and the writings of the period, that these rules were actually followed. In many ways, they're more advanced than what we have today. So it's not like ancient laws are just ancient and primitive. They are actually some ways more advanced. There are many examples of such rules of independence of states, respecting independence of states, republicanism. The first peace treaty, for example, was between Egypt and Hathi, one of the two great powers. That was in 1259 BC, laid out non-intervention, non-aggression, mutual extradition of each other's sort of criminals and rebels, and alliances, just like NATO. So all these principles are there. Why? Because human beings try to find similar solutions to similar problems. When they're facing a problem of anarchy, violence, or lack of communication, they come up with similar ideas. And they're not all that different in a basic rudimentary form. Of course, there are variations, but you can't say that they're exclusively belongs to one civilization or one nation. And I find examples in South America, North America, the pre-Columbian civilizations, in Islam, in China and India. I'm not talking about that for the lack of time. So finally then, what are the other lessons here? This is the last. What is the future? Now we hear a lot about statements from the Canadian Prime Minister, the Finnish President. The Finnish President said the era of Western-dominated world order is over. He said that in 2026. I said that in 2014. The age of Western hegemony is over. The post-war liberal world order is coming to an end. Mr. Khani says the liberal order was a delusion. I actually said that the same thing in 2014 because it didn't benefit everybody. It was good in many ways, but it was a club of the West. Mr. I'm reversing them. The Finnish president said about the Western dominated world order. Mr. Carney said, nostalgia is not a strategy. It's not just pining for what we left behind. Well, my book ended by saying, and this is this book, the last paragraph, that instead of pining for the bygone world order, aspire to the West with the rest, not West versus the rest. I am really if there is one thing that I want to preach, if I become a preacher, if I want to advocate as opposed to being an analyst, I say get rid of the West versus the rest. The leaders and the prime ministers and the people like Mr. Borrell, get rid of the West versus the rest. There was no West, there was no rest. The West is a very recent, maybe the Cold War. The Roman Empire was divided into Western and Eastern. But that was a geographic thing, a little bit cultural. The West is a simply geographic expression. The Chinese had their West, but it was actually, in some ways, going to India to learn Buddhism, the journey to the West. Those are physical expressions. The idea of a West as a political entity and sometimes acquired a racist connotation that West is superior, the rest is inferior. That's a very modern recent construct. The rest is also the same thing. The global South, the third world. This is a reaction against the West. So you get rid of the West, get rid of the rest, you will have a lot more openness, a lot of possibility for building a more inclusive, not necessarily a peaceful world order. Maybe new ideas will come up, like the European Union doing today, signing an agreement with India, the mother of all trade deals. Nobody would have thought it's possible because India is notoriously protectionist and the European Union is notoriously rule-bound, but they were able to come together. The agreement with Mercosur, interregionalism, multilateralism, the United States abandons it, but Europe can preserve it. With other, I call it the world minus one moment. For the time being, forget about the United States. But the rest of the world can actually join hands through these principles. And because world order is nobody's monopoly, and just because a particular world order is weakening doesn't mean the whole world is collapsing. Thank you.
Well, Professor, thank you so much for your presentation because, well, lessons from history help us understand better what's happening today. And then that brings me to the present, and you've said that no world order is permanent. Do you think that recent developments in Venezuela, in the Middle East, or in Ukraine as well, are putting at risk the Western liberal rules-based international order, or we are already in another phase? Are we already moving to a different kind of order?
Well, we are in a transition. We're in a transitional phase. The old order is decaying, dying, but the new is not born yet. But we see some patterns. First of all, I actually don't think, depending on what you mean by the old order, the elements of liberal order will survive because they were not created. They're not the monopoly of the West alone. Many of the principles like free trade, multilateral cooperation, they were not necessarily a creation of the United States after World War II. So because it's a shared creation, and the global South countries, a lot of my book also talks about how the global South countries join hands with the Western countries. Remember, there are 30 countries out of 50 in San Francisco conference that belong to the global South. Today's global South, mostly Latin American countries, because they're already independent. But you had India before independence, was allowed to join, and was instrumental in creating ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council. So Republican China played a very important role in creation of human rights mechanisms. So because of that, because there's a shared interest in maintaining world order, we should not think that just what is happening now in the last few years means the collapse of the whole world. So I remain optimistic, and we see some signs. The defiance of the European countries of very arbitrary, aggressive policies of the United States is, to me, hope. The joining of hands between countries like Mercosur, India, and Europe and Australia is a sign of hope. Nobody is following the United States under Trump to as the wrecking ball of the world order.
But it is true that you talk about the decline of the West in terms of influence and especially dominance. And influence and dominance are very often exercised through the economic and the military power. What we are seeing these days is the United States very aggressive in military terms, and the dollar is still the global currency. How does it work with your idea of a multiplex world?
It sort of goes back, first of all, to my original point. You should never put all your eggs in one basket. Why is the US has that much economic and military power? Let me give you a slight little history. In 1950s and 60s, the US was the largest exporting country in the world. In the 1990s, US is the largest importing country in the world. And during that time, the American market absorbed exports from everywhere. Every country became dependent on the United States. So Trump wakes up and says, hey, this is an instrument of leverage. Everybody needs the American market. So tariffs, the most beautiful thing for him is the tariffs. So he is using that. But how long can he do this? Now countries realize that unipolarity may be looking good. Multipolarity may be a danger zone, but unipolarity is a fatal attraction, like the Fatal Attraction movie, right? You just die in the end because you're attracted to something. The United States can abandon you because it has so much power. This is my argument against hegemony. It will take a decade if the US doesn't change course, continue to use economic sanctions, countries will get out of the dollar. They will find ways. There will be turbulence. But ultimately, what Trump is doing is shooting himself in the feet or undermining the economic power of the United States. Same for military power. The United States has incomparable power to destroy, but little power to rebuild. When Trump says we are the largest, greatest army in the world, it's all about destruction, right? It's not about building anything. But even that destruction doesn't always achieve political objectives. So you can project power, but you cannot solve conflicts. So Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, many of the regional conflicts the US had to withdraw or abandon because just raw military power doesn't do that for you. The US military can be globally dominant, but I don't think it can prevail so easily in a conflict with China and the Taiwan Straits. So there is a difference between having raw military power and using it for political ends to achieve your political goals. So that way, and also countries will become relatively independent. The Europeans are already doing that because you know that it may take time and it's not going to be easy, but diversification is a national security, a regional security strategy.
That brings me to NATO. A few years ago, President Macron described the alliance as brain dead, as you remember. But right now, we are seeing growing uncertainty about the US commitment with the alliance. What's the future of NATO in Europe?
Well, I mentioned this in the meeting on Saturday. NATO is like a cat, like 9 lives, right? NATO may have 11 lives.
Our cats have 7.
So it finds a way so after Cold War, and academics, the NATO is over, the NATO is back. Then there was 9/11. NATO has no relevance in terrorism. NATO is there. Kosovo, I mean, you an out of area. So I think NATO is quite important because European countries, until they have a degree of self-sufficiency, they cannot abandon NATO simply. But what if the US walks out? Well, there are, of course, constitutional constraints. They cannot just walk out of NATO. And if Trump does that through an executive order without congressional support, it's going to be challenged, and he'll probably lose that. New president can restore US membership in NATO. But I also think that NATO, Europe has to seriously think, again, a point I made on Saturday. Mr. Borrell will know, of course, personally, that more than 2/3 of NATO members are EU members and vice versa. So there is a great overlap. So European Union can have its cake and eat it too. Do good things, normative things, look good in the world, do through the European Union. If you want to really do geopolitical things, intervene, block other countries, you do it through NATO. Can't do that, up to your point. So I think European Union, Europeans will have to decide that there are certain things, both geopolitically and normatively, they have to do themselves. And again, it's not going to happen overnight, but I don't think it's impossible over a medium to longer term.
Inés, Arco, yeah.
Yes, if I can maybe add on
Fellow
to
at
that.
CIDOB.
Because when we talk about the liberal international order, normally when we talk, it's about 4 pillars, right? This is something that John Ikenberry has spoken about, that it's economic openness, security cooperation, like common security cooperation. Also, let me think, multilateralism, and obviously democratic solidarity. And I wanted to maybe enter in this point because NATO is very much related to this idea on this common security cooperation that it's now putting into a little bit on discussion with the United States. And I want to maybe open the picture to Asia, because obviously in Asia we don't have this multilateral security cooperation as NATO, the SEATO that Professor Acharya has written very extensively, died a long time ago. But we have this system of the hub and spokes alliances, that the United States has this bilateral relationship with powers such as Japan, South Korea. It used to do so with the Republic of China and also with Philippines and Thailand. And maybe also I think that this is an important point of view because what happens in NATO and how we also see these security alliances with the Gulf states are bringing a broader configuration of how we think about this common security. So I think that maybe also we need to understand the interconnection on these messages that the United States is giving to Europe, but also to all the Gulf states now during the Iranian war. Because there's connections, right? One of the things that we have seen the last days is that South Korea, for instance, accepted the deployment of THAAD, so air missile systems in their territory, with a diplomatic cost with China. Part of these missiles are now being retired, and they are sent to the Gulf because of all the attacks of Iran. So we have even these military alliances that now are being not put into question because, well, we don't know if the United States is going to help us or not, but even because there's a part of dismantling those. And I think that this is a very important part that we need to take into account because this is one of the key pillars of this liberal order that it's now into contestation. And that will bring maybe on how other powers think of military alliances. To what extent are those sources of security with other countries, or they can become elements of insecurity?
Okay, if I can give a very blunt answer to that, one of the best things that happened to Asia was not having an Asian NATO. Because that attempt was made. People say that U.S. never wanted to create an Asian NATO. That's not true. That's what I have written about based on archival sources. The U.S. very much wanted an Asian NATO, but couldn't do it because the major Asian countries like Indonesia, India, Ceylon, and Burma those days were influenced. They rejected. We do not want a military alliance in a collective sense. So what you are talking about is actually collective defense, not common security.
Sorry, yes.
So, and because the Asians felt that a collective defense system will provoke adversaries too much, including China. And China, in some ways, is like Russia to Europe. It's right next door to many of these countries. Even the Southeast Asian countries rejected it. We don't want to have, we cannot have provocative defense. We'll have non-provocative defense. But they also smartly thought we can have bilateral agreements. They're more flexible, and they can be adjusted. And so Asia has all those bilateral alliances, which terms are very similar to NATO, but in a bilateral sense, only bilateral sense. They're more flexible. So Japan, then South Korea, Republic of China. This ended when Taiwan, Republic of China, lost its recognition as an independent state in the UN. But Philippines, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand. So these system, hubs and spoke, is more flexible and non-provocative. So for example, if South Korea provoked China, it's South Korea-China thing. It's not a Japan-China thing. Kind of de-risk yourself, de-risk the region. I think that's much smarter. Although I do recognize that situations are different. I mean, you have a land, Europe is basically a landmass, land theater, Asia is more of a maritime theater, and the different logic applies. But having said that, Asians do not want to create a NATO, do not want to create a NATO, precisely because they want to have security with, not against China. Now, unfortunately, that was not the case for whatever reason. We don't have time to go into this, but we have not only NATO, but we have expanded NATO. And again, I think Asia is very lucky not to have a NATO.
In the recent month, we've seen Europe, the European Union in this case, moving closer and faster to other partners with commercial agreements because of the Trump stance. Do you think this is something we will see more in the future?
I think very much so. That's the way of the future. I talk about the world -1 and the interregionalism. European Union is kind of the world champion of interregionalism. Even before now, they had partnerships in Africa, with ASEAN, helping ASEAN to strengthen institutional capacity with different sub-regional groupings. That's a great way to build resilience. Now, in the old days, earlier it was kind of a luxury, kind of a normative purpose. Now it's necessity, because that's the way you can actually build cooperation and compensate for losing the American backing to some extent. Some of them can be consequential. I mentioned the EU-India agreement. We'll see how it works out. But this is one of the largest trade agreements in the world, and very unexpected in the sense that it was going on negotiations are going on, but I was very surprised that India could actually agree to this because it's a very protectionist country. So these interregional agreements with Mercosur, with Australia, Canada, and this doesn't have to be just trade agreements. They can be security agreements. I mean, there are countries, middle powers, and good defense manufacturing countries like South Korea, like Brazil, India also. It produces a lot of weapons and technology. Developing these partnerships can also, and those countries have been market for European weapons, like India buys a lot of aircraft from France, for example. But if you can also multilateralize it and make it more in that direction, I think we can also add a defense component to the interregional arrangement. Now, again, we think the United States is the be-all and end-all of European defense. It's a mindset. You have to when it was working fine. I mean, it's no longer working. What do? So close your bags and go home and just sit there, do nothing, or you start doing things. And European Union has the nuclear power with 2 countries, more than 500 nuclear weapons. It has aircraft carriers. So it's a political will is the thing. And sometimes political will can come without when there's no other choice, no other option available. So that's the avenue worth exploring. What will be really wrong is for the Europeans to think that let's wait another 3 years or 3 years and 9 months, and Trump will be out and everything will go back to normal. That will be a serious mistake. Opportunity lost. You can rebuild relations with the U.S., but you can forgive, but don't forget. The difference between forgiving and forgetting.
If maybe I can add also onto that, beyond, for instance, the free trade agreement with India, Europe signed a free trade agreement with Indonesia. That was last September, and it was very interesting because on the negotiations in how to sign interregional free trade pact between ASEAN countries, so Southeast Asian nations and Europe, there has been a lot of difficulties, domestic in some cases, more onto domestic also events in Asian countries. But one thing that for me was very much interesting is that Indonesia has been a power that has been very vocal on maybe arguing that Europe was being more protectionist, unilateral, and even blaming Europe to continue some neo-colonial practices, for instance, on trying to obtain natural resources from Indonesia. And very quickly, with Trump arrived on the White House and the Liberation Day tariffs, those trade agreements and those trade negotiations that had been completely frozen between Indonesia and the EU went very well, very quickly. I think that here, when we need, and we know now, for instance, that Philippines, Malaysia are also trying to get these similar type of agreements. But here I think that one of the things that we need to be careful of is to what extent those free trade agreements are as liberalizing, as comprehensive as the EU wants it to be. And I think that this is maybe also the case with India.
Do they have to be as liberalizing an EU? So the thing is, you are setting a very high bar and bring your expectations down, and there's still a lot of things that can happen. So the problem with the European Union, and I'm not the first one to point this out, I do interregionalism and regionalism, as you know. The ASEAN countries have also done their own internal free trade agreement, and there's nothing like the European Union. A lot of this is voluntary compliance, a lot of this is based on consensus, but there are still rules, and they are incremental. So, but the European Union wants either everything or nothing, like a platinum standard. I think to be realistic, that's unrealistic. So and because of the necessity of having to do things because of Trump, so countries are coming together, and this may be a time for European Union to rethink some of the rigidity and be a little more flexible, because that's the only way you can go ahead. And really, Indonesia was the fourth largest country in the world, and the largest Muslim country. It is good to have Indonesia, even if you have to make some concessions. I know there are concerns about human rights, concerns about protectionism, but if you can do it with India, I know India and Indonesia very well. I spent a lot of time in Indonesia studying the country. So there's corruption, there is a certain amount of authoritarianism despite being democratic, but you have to deal with these things from a more pragmatic basis, because this is, you have to also fight transactionalism with transactionalism, not with entirely moral absolute principles. But the goal is, and the end product will be still good for both Europe and Indonesia and the rest of the world.
Another question. In this multiplex world, what role can a medium-sized country such as Spain play in shaping the global order?
Spain is a middle-sized country. I thought it was an empire. Hegemon, and Spain has more ex-colonies than probably any other country except Britain, right? So I think that's a good question. There is a lot of talk about middle powers these days. I have attended many conferences, seminars on middle powers, and like everything, it's a bit of a hype, right? So it is important. Middle powers are always important, but I think they cannot resolve all the problems. But the good thing about middle powers work best when they're niche players. They don't try to do everything. They can't. So Spain has to decide where it can play the role, areas, and which part of the world. So maybe focus on Latin America, maybe focus on certain types of trade. So the idea of a middle power coalition, to me, it's not going to work. To bring together even the BRICS, were kind of some great powers, some middle powers, it's not working. But coalition, ad hoc coalitions, but committing to the same purpose of arresting the decline of multilateralism, upholding the international rules like non-intervention, non-aggression, Spain is doing. By the way, among all the European countries, Spain is now recognized as the most defiant nation of when it comes to Trump's aggressive policies. And that creates a very positive vibe in the global south. By the way, it creates a very positive vibe also in parts of the West and Canada, Australia, for example. So here is an opportunity to play into that role. And and saying that when the time comes, the United States wants to return to the fold, I don't think Americans are going to be very angry because Spain did this to Trump. In fact, there are many Americans will be happy that some countries are standing up to Trump, that they can't do it because Trump is in power. So use that as a basis, but keep open to the possibility of reconciling with the United States someday, but build diversification, build different strategies, and build bridges with other parts of the world. Maybe even bilateral agreements. Bilateralism is not a dirty word. People used to think anything bilateral is bad. As long as they're consistent with WTO rules, and they can be, it's actually the way to go at the moment. Minilateralism would be another way to go.
I wanted to maybe ask you a question, because one of the first authors that I wrote about middle powers coming together in a type of coalition, that was an idea from Moon Chung-il, who is a professor at Yonsei University in Korea and who used to be an advisor to former South Korean President Moon Jae-in. And his idea was that these middle countries, these middle powers should get together in a certain way on trying to, balance a little bit the competition between the United States and China. At that moment, that was 2023, he said, those middle powers maybe should go to the United States and try to calm down a little bit the competition with China, because that was the most reasonable power of the two. I guess that this argument could not be done nowadays at all, but to what extent do you see that maybe this middle power coalition can also be talking to China and trying to moderate the different shocks that are going on at the moment in the world?
Well, you have the Canadians are now building bridges with China after pulling out over 3-4 years. Canada also trying to build bridges with India, which is kind of in between power, between middle and great power. And I think the important thing is I have lived in 2 middle power countries. I studied in Australia, I did my graduate studies, and I got most of my career advancement in Canada. And I am seen this discourse of what middle powers can do. Middle powers can create ideas and norms and be mediators and solve disputes. A lot of this is because it's a bit of a hype, right? They can't be great powers. They can also don't want to be marginalized. So academics and policymakers want to carve out a niche. I'm always a bit skeptical about this. But who is a middle power is also important. In the old days, like Cold War, to talk of a middle power, it'll be all mostly Canada, Australia, Sweden, Norway. They're all mostly Western countries. Now you talk about a middle power, you bring in Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea, of course, is the authentic middle power. So the range of middle power, according to one study done by the Indonesian think tank, there are about 18 middle powers in the world. That's a pretty large group. And it's good if you can have a common interest. There's never going to be a common interest that you can identify. So doing things on an ad hoc basis, coalition of the willing, is much more feasible. There is a shared interest to maintain the current world order. No middle power wants to destroy the current world order. They want to be mediators. They want to be go-betweens. They want to create new kinds of norms and ideas. So let's do that. But let's not hope that everything is going to happen because there will be a cohesion. The middle powers, like Canada created the idea of peacekeeping. As you know, Lester Pearson, Canadian Prime Minister, should be credited for inventing the idea of peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping. And the Australians and Canadians did responsibility to protect, along with the Africans. So Africa also can be a role in this role. So let's not be a prisoner of a concept and a category that we middle powers can only do this. What about regional powers? What about, like Singapore? Is Singapore a middle power or an emerging power? Singapore is profoundly consequential. I mean, I lived there for also a decade. They can do a lot of things. So create the broadest possible coalition to achieve the best defense of multilateral rules-based order.
Yes, Professor, you very often speak about the Western-centric perspective of in international relations. Do we tend to overestimate the role of the West in maintaining the global order?
Depends on who you ask. I mean, if you ask to a American political scientist, who not anymore though, but until 10, 15 years ago, they say yes, the West is central to everything, but the rest of the world finds it an overemphasis on the West, because the evidence shows, like, you're talking about the discipline of international relations, or the practice of international relations. We talk about international relations as a distinctive field. You can say that it started in the West, right? It was basically first chair of international relations in the University of Wales in Aberystwyth in 1919. But the subject of international relations that I'm talking about, what is sovereignty? What is territorial integrity? You know, the first territorial boundary was between Suma and Lagash, two Sumerian states. We still have that in the British Museum. So this is the boundary between two states. The first peace treaty between Egypt and Hatti, the first great power concert, also in the Near East, the humanitarian principles. The Chinese invented systems of statecraft and open meritocratic exams for the civil service, which is the big foundation of world order. So if you look at the subject matter of international relations, as opposed to the discipline or naming of a discipline, you'll find that it's not Western-centric. But we don't know that, because people, we have been, when I was trained, and many of the things I write about this book, I didn't know 15 years ago, because we are all trained in India and Australia. I studied there also, and taught initially in Canada, that everything came out of the West. And there was no history of international relations outside of the West in political science. Historians knew it, but political scientists don't interact with historians very much. And so you have to, therefore, go beyond political science and to history to dig this out, and that's what I've been doing for 15 years, trying to figure out all these multiple global origins of the subject of international relations. Even if the discipline of the international relations was invented in University of Wales, or now called Aberystwyth University. Most of the universities those days were in UK, Europe, or US. Now that's not the case. Indonesia has 50 universities that offer undergraduate courses, maybe more than now, in international relations. It's an expanding subject. Turkey, China, Brazil, South Africa. So this discipline has to change or will die.
We can now open the floor to the audience. Yeah.
I think there's a microphone.
Identify yourself.
Use the microphone, please. Yeah.
Is it okay if I sit? Yeah. This security void that has been discussed here, that has been exposed in last weeks even more, will contribute to this multilateral world that you've been discussing. However, I guess there is a consensus that this multiplexity will cause some reshuffling in the geographical order. Probably China will want to improve their situation in the South China Sea and in the First Belt. Russia will want to improve their situation in the Baltic exit, and United States is already kind of expressing their willingness to control the Western Hemisphere. They did, Venezuela, now Cuba, and most probably in future other countries. This is, I guess, an implication of the multiplexity of the world. However, my question is, so Spain as a country, as you said, has many ex-colonies, and these ex-colonies, even though can be still considered as a great resource of human potential, well, it's a great market both from Latin American companies and for Spanish companies expanding to Latin America. If United States claims now the Western Hemisphere as their, well, basically a zone of, as their zone of interest, then do you think Spain and Portugal should take more proactive action in, defending the, I would say, their connection and the trade that they have with countries in Latin America?
I'm not a big expert on Spanish foreign policy, but I would think they should. Yes, they should. Because especially if they're asked to do. The important question is asked to. I showed you the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty. There is a clause that Egypt should help Hatti if Hatti is attacked by another party, but only if asked, not unilaterally. Consent is very important, even in 15th century BC. So I don't think Spain and Portugal should unilaterally go, I'm going to help you, even if you want it or not. That will be a violation of international law. And the second thing is, I am not quite sure is it so easy for countries to just break out of the rules and start taking advantage of what the US is doing, the unraveling of the liberal order. Because there are still international rules and norms that constrain states. The United States is a very exceptional case. There's something called American exceptionalism. It has so much power and dominance these days that it can afford to do that. But sooner or later, it will come to grief. And the biggest cost to the US will be domestic, not international. No country can challenge the US, but the people and the economy will suffer. It's already suffering. Lived in the United States for 20 years, 18 years now, and we have seen how our cost of living has gone up. Inflation continues. People are not happy. Trump's popularity is very low at the moment. And sooner or later, if the petrodollar unravels because of the blockades, the Gulf states decide to withdraw their reserves to some extent, I think the world will look very different. The Russians are, they can take advantage, but they're also suffering. I mean, they're losing a lot of people. The economy is in pretty bad shape. So it depends on what kind of leaders you will have. And leadership is very, very, very important. And I cannot predict anything, but I don't think it's that easy to sort of create the kind of mayhem only the US can create. Under Trump, I'm not saying US generally.
-1. I wonder whether we could also talk about a world -2. I mean, world -1 would assume that Europe would cooperate with the rest of the world to isolate the United States and diversify until the United States wanted to come back and would have to come back under new conditions. But that's assuming that Europe would cooperate with the rest of the world. Now, if Europe doesn't cooperate with the rest of the world, could we see a world -2 situation where the rest of the world goes ahead creating an order without either the United States or the European Union? You know, the processes that the United States or the Trump regime have put in process are going to create some important worldwide changes. You know. Their idea that monopoly on petroleum would control the world is going to accelerate the use of alternative energies. And those alternative energies are not going to come from the West. You know. The alternative energies coming out of China are helping developing countries develop more quickly because they now have sources of energy that do not depend on petroleum. And the tariff wars are going to force economic diversification. So to what extent could you say that Asia, Africa, the Indo-Pacific region don't really need either the United States or the European Union to begin creating an order to replace what we have now?
They don't need, but they would not want to also isolate the European Union. The European Union does provide a lot of benefits to countries like India. You saw that. Out of necessity, sometimes out of pressure, and in terms of technology, it's a big provider of technology, either bilaterally, if not multilaterally, but everything in the European Union, even the defense industries, have a multilateral regional component. So it's not like the European Union is completely irrelevant to the needs of Indo-Pacific countries. And China, also there is this question of suspicion of China. Even if China can provide all the goods that Asia needs, maybe Asia doesn't want to be dependent on China. learn the lesson. Don't be dependent on any single power. So they will also look to alternatives, potential alternatives, some sort of a hedging. Asians are very good at hedging. So I would not say that world minus two is going to be a easy thing. And also remember, world minus one happened because the US doesn't want to be part of the world, not because other countries wanted to kick US out of the world. The United States itself doesn't want to be part of the world. I don't know if Europe wants to be in that situation. Europe doesn't want the rest of the world. On the other hand, we see evidence to the contrary, engaging with countries of the global south. But even if that happens, we would not have a Sino-centric world or an Indo-centric world because none of these countries have the ability to provide all the needs for technological, economic development assistance and the clean energy that Indo-Pacific countries need. Europe will definitely remain in the picture, unless Europe doesn't want to be. That we don't want to be part of it. What will Europe do? Where will it go? Become a fortress and just live in isolation? Europe doesn't want to live in isolation. I don't see anybody, Mr. Borrell can tell us, you ever thought about being in isolation? Is it a good thing? Just leave us alone? It's always been engaging other countries. Yeah.
Thank you. No, I don't have an answer, but it depends what do you understand by isolation. Some member states of the European Union would like to be in isolation from the point of view of demography and migration. Some would like to say, I'm going to build a wall and nobody's going to come in. Hungary is a typical example. Others are much more realistic. But I don't have a precise answer. We have to go more in detail, but if you can ask me, what do you really mean by world minus one moment? Who is the one minus the rest?
Well, the one is the United States.
But why the United States? You can imagine also others, no?
Yeah, you can also imagine, but they're not going to be as consequential. If, let's say, with due respect, say Malaysia wants to withdraw from the world. I love Malaysia. I go there all the time. That won't make much difference. But if, say, in fact, a country like Singapore, which is much smaller than Malaysia, much economically much more consequential, decides to withdraw from the world will lose a major financial center, So you have to look at competency of different countries and their consequence on the global political economy or security. If you think, countries that may seem insignificant, like Australia, they are very consequential for their own region. Australia plays a very important role in South Pacific and Southeast Asia. But I think in this case, I meant United States. I mean, this is just like a way of capturing what Trump has been doing, pulling himself out of many multilateral organizations and agreements, like the Paris Agreement and all. So this article is actually kind of tongue-in-cheek, a kind of political commentary, a satirical commentary, polemical commentary. And I was encouraged by the editor of the Foreign Policy to go all out and just to articulate it, because otherwise it'll be boring and people won't read it, right? So world minus one, you can say world minus the US. That's basically, originally my term was world minus the US.
But if the US wants to leave alone, why should they have a seventh fleet patrolling the whole world? Why do they need fleets patrolling all the seas in the world? If they want to be isolated, they can prevent.
So that might happen. The US may stop sending the Seventh Fleet. I mean, there is always a streak of isolationism. I'm not saying that's what President Trump is doing, but I think some of what you see in US foreign policy is a matter of habit, right? So US has been used to deploying its fleet. And there are two issues with that. One is that there will be no Seventh Fleet without military bases all over the world. The United States is a global superpower, not because of its military technology, but it has the largest number of allies in the world, largest number. There's no comparison between the number of American allies and allies of China has not one or two, maybe none, maybe
Korea.
Djibouti or France or Russia. Nobody has their ally. And the allies provide not just good, nice-sounding words of flattery, they actually provide military bases, just like you know in Spain, in Europe. So United States depends on that. It's habituated with playing the role. But Trump came into office talking about no more wars, no more. The national security strategy of the U.S. released in December last year said we don't want to be policemen in the world. So one could see that there is that philosophical sort of conceptual argument. But Trump doesn't read. Trump doesn't follow what his advisors tell him. So a lot of people are very distressed by the fact that Trump is violating exactly what he said he won't do. Like interventions, endless wars, another Middle East war. But you have a person who just acts by whim for whatever reason. So my sense is that the U.S. will continue to deploy the Seventh Fleet up to a point because it brings benefits. There is a very strong calculation. I've seen the calculation how much money Canada just recently said that it spends about 70% of its defense spending on the U.S. The European countries, NATO countries, provide billions and billions of dollars to the U.S. During the 1991 Gulf War, Japan gave U.S. $10 billion, just cash. Take it and fight. So I don't think the United States can sustain a global military presence unless it either extorted or received both physical support and financial support. And at least the American economy cannot sustain it. My point is that US -1, and also it's a moment. Remember, it's a moment. It's not an era. It's just a fleeting moment. And I think it may not last beyond Trump. Just like we had a unipolar moment, and not a unipolar age. So this is basically all about how do you continue with multilateralism when the US is not playing the multilateral role. And is multilateralism going to collapse? My argument is there are ways to maintain multilateralism without a collapse. That's what this article is about. But I don't see this as a permanent. It could be the US might decide completely isolation, like early 18th century or 19th century isolationism. When US talked about entangling alliances, don't have anything to do with the European type of alliances. We want to live in our continent. But that age, US was agriculturally self-sufficient. It didn't have an industrial economy. Today, US has an industrial economy. It depends on critical minerals. It can't go stealing, coercing countries to give this mineral, that mineral. The Chinese refused. The US had to make a deal with them. So I think let's not overestimate American staying power as an isolationist nation in the 21st century. So I hope the world -1, world without the US, is a moment, not an era, a permanent feature.
Hello, thank you very much, Professor Amitav. It's a pleasure, and it's amazing to hear you and all your knowledge. I have, first of all, one comment and then two questions. Then, for example, I'm from North Catalonia, and we had there a philosopher that he was speaking about the map of the history. It's called Deulofeu, and he's saying the rise and the fall of the empires, very similar to the thing that you are saying. And I'm very happy to hear this idea again. And then my first question is about if you think that the bamboo diplomacy is something that is all around ASEAN, not just one of the countries, not just Thailand, if it's everyone in ASEAN. And the other question is, what do you think is expecting ASEAN about the EU? What is the paper that and the role that wants ASEAN about the EU is taking in Indo-Pacific? Thank you
Sorry,
very
I
much.
didn't get the first question. Can you?
Yeah, if the first question, if you think if the bamboo diplomacy,
Bamboo diplomacy.
this idea of like the hedging of ASEAN around, like all these countries, if it's something like in just a few countries, or if it's ASEAN strategy,
Okay.
and the role of EU in ASEAN.
And the second question?
What do you think is expecting the ASEAN about the EU and his role in Indo-Pacific? Thank you very much.
Bamboo diplomacy is not ASEAN diplomacy. It's Thai diplomacy. It's a term that people apply to Thailand, bending with the wind. And Thailand does that historically. People have written books about it. A friend of mine in Bangkok just released a book about bamboo diplomacy. So side with China when China gives you advantage, side with the US when the US gives you certain benefits. But ASEAN's policy is not bamboo diplomacy. It's what I call multi-engagement or co-engagement. Engage equally as much as possible to all sides. So ASEAN never takes sides in the kind of US-China rivalry or Japan-China rivalry. It wants to be the neutral broker. And in some ways, it succeeds because ASEAN invites all the major powers of the international system to come to an ASEAN capital once a year. You must have attended these meetings. And it is done in a very transparent, to the extent possible, and not playing one against the other. Some countries may do that individually, but not collectively. ASEAN never does that collectively. And I think that policy has served ASEAN well, not taking sides with China against the US or US against China. The Americans are putting a lot of pressure on the Trump administration, forcing ASEAN to choose sides. So you cannot do trade with China in this way if you trade with us. But I think that's not going to work. I really don't think that's going to work. And on the question of ASEAN's relations to the EU, I just want to, mention this in my intervention on Saturday. The European Union is considered the most trusted partner for Southeast Asia, according to opinion polls. So every year, I don't know, the last one just came out, the Singaporean think tank, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, where I started my career, does an opinion poll. And they polled about 1,000 odd elites. So which countries are the most, one of the questions, trusted partner? You can count on doing the right thing in international affairs. And European Union always comes out at number one. Japan comes out in the same league, but then followed by US, China, India. So European Union doesn't have a trust deficit with the elite of Southeast Asia. There are individual countries that have problems, Indonesians have problems. This is all about corruption, human rights, the kind of social charter of EU. But in terms of trusting the rule-abiding nature of the European Union, that has always been a positive. And I see that, I have been involved, I was based in Singapore for about 10 years. And the first time I came to Barcelona was the Asia-Euro Foundation to a meeting in Barcelona. And the EU funded it. My mentor, Tommy Coe, Ambassador Tommy Coe, was the president, the chair of that Asia-Euro Foundation. And I think, I'm not exaggerating European Union's soft power, okay? It's not, but because the European Union is neither China nor the US, it gets kind of a pass in the trust game. And I think that's a good soft power to preserve.
Thank you.
Three last questions. Be brief, please. One,
Okay.
two, and the other one.
Thank you, Professor. My question is more philosophical, if you want, because I would like to think about the language of something more, more as a tool, not just something neutral, as a tool for creating reality. And I would like to ask you if you share that perspective, and if so,
Can you repeat the first part?
yeah,
I slightly got
that
distracted.
I like to think about the language of something like a tool for creating or shaping the reality. And I would like to ask you if you share this perspective, and if so, if we should change the word the others, or the rest, sorry. If we are talking about the rest, and if there is another word to talk about, for example, the South or the other countries. Because I tend to think about, for example, the failed states perspective, that I don't like to talk about failed state because it's like failed to whom or for what. And that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm still a little confused. Which reality you want to change? The state-to-state perspective?
The name of the rest, or from
Yes.
the West
Oh, the
and
rest,
the
the
rest.
rest.
Yes, the rest.
Okay, well, I have a term called multiplex. I mean, I don't like the West versus the rest. So let's look at the history of the rest. So first it was the Third World, right? In the 1950s. A French journalist, I believe, created the Third Estate. So Third World, First World, Second World, Third World. Then it became Global South in the 80s, and an American journalist coined it. Then people like Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore talked about West versus the rest. He was one of the most influential creator of the rest concept. And it's a term of convenience, like it's no real conceptual, historical, intrinsic basis to West versus the rest. But it has profound consequences. Let me tell you, in my book I mentioned, when Samuel Huntington talked about class of civilization, if you read his article in Foreign Affairs and his book in 1996, he says the class of civilization is a matter of West versus the rest. And he quoted Kishore Mahbubani. So the class of civilization is not among the Western countries, even though the Slavic civilizations and the Western European civilization may be different, but he was talking about the West and the rest, means the global South. This has created a lot of grief. It's very artificial throughout history, as my book says. The West and the rest, so-called rest, have learned from each other. They borrowed ideas. The Greeks borrowed from Egyptians astronomy and art from also Egypt, Sumerian science, and the Muslims borrowed from Greeks science philosophy and passed it on to the Europeans and also created a lot of their own ideas. So throughout history, as Brodel said, no civilization has progressed without learning from others. And there is no East versus West. Nowhere you can tell me that there is a book in the Bible or in a philosophical work of the medieval or the early modern period, the term there is a West and there is a rest. Europe is there. But even Europe is controversial, by the way. There's a chapter in my book on Europe that starts with, what is Europe? Where did it come from? You know, if you really go that far, Europe was named by Asia. Europa was the princess of Tyre, Lebanon. Okay? And Asia was named by Europe because Asia was a province of the Roman Empire. So there is no basis to this. This is just verbal jugglery by pundits and commentators to create a division. Makes political sense, but doesn't mean they have a permanent basis to it. So the rest is a category that, like Global South, that's like a trade union. We are the marginalized, we are the victims. And I agree, I have sympathy for that. But you want to get rid of that. And that mindset has to change. So what terms can you use? I say multiplex is a good idea, but it doesn't sound so simple, right? So I invite you to think of a term that in my next edition I can put in. But I think this is the last paragraph of the book basically says, get rid of West versus the rest. It has created a lot of grief, a lot of division, a lot of hostility, suspicion, racism, except that it has no historical basis. Guilt, no historical basis. The great philosophers did not talk about West versus the rest. They talked about Europe, they talked about standard of civilization, but not in this modern sense that somehow we have a distinctive West and a distinctive rest.
For taking that question, I think Inés. What?
I'm fine.
Yeah, Professor, you mentioned before that political scientists don't talk too much with historians, but you have read history, the classics from different countries, different regions, and I'm curious, over your life, how have you built your intellectual diet? How do you choose what to read, what directions to take?
Thank you very much. I think there is a lesson for all of us here. And one day I'll write an article or a book about writing this book. You have read the book, have you?
No, not yet.
Okay, please do. Look, you'll find that you are so right, that there is so much sources here. Classics, so when I talk about Alexander, I read Aryan. I don't read modern textbooks. Of course, they're translated. I don't read Greek. But when you talk about the Persia, ancient Persia, I read Herodotus. When I talk about Athens versus Sparta, I read Thucydides. And same for India, I read Kautilya, inscriptions of Ashoka. A lot of the book is based on actually traveling and museums. Museums are the best source of information for this book. The British Museum, the Louvre, and museums in Denmark, museums in, even art museums like Prado in Madrid, in Cordoba, in Granada. I have traveled China. You do get a feel for it. And sometimes museums provide the best source of, you can see the object and you can say reading, then you go and triangulate. You go and read the books about where this thing come from. So the cylinder I'm talking about, the first boundary marker, you can find that in the British Museum. Then you read about it. The Egyptian Hittite peace treaty in Istanbul Archaeological Museum. So you can see it and then read about it. The Amarna diplomacy, that in chunks of it is in New York, Metropolitan Museum of Arts. So if you do that, you get interested. For me, writing the book is possible only because I like to travel, I like to see new places, I would like to educate myself. That's how it started. But later on, it became a passion. And the single most important thing that drove me to write this book is because I was, in some ways, frustrated but angry. Angry because there are so many things in history that I did not know. How did I get an education? I was educated in fairly good places. I mean, some in Asia, some in the US, and some in Australia. And we read the same textbooks. There was no difference in textbooks. It's basically Western-dominated produced textbooks that routinely exclude much of what I'm talking about. I had no idea, by the way, that there was a peace treaty between Egyptians and Hittites that almost word by word mimics the UN Charter. I didn't know that the Code of Manu anticipated the Geneva Conventions. And there is a lot more. The idea that Ibn Rushd, who spent a lot of Averroes in Cordoba, actually, without Ibn Rushd, we may not have European Enlightenment. Because you know the story, that he was not a translator, he was a commentator, that's what he's called. And he commented on more than 30, about 36 texts of Aristotle. And the Holy Roman Emperor in Sicily, the Frederick II, not Frederick the Great, collected a lot of these translations out of here, Cordoba, passed it to university in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, the early universities, where philosophers were struggling against the Catholic Church. The church basically said, only God created the world. You philosophers are wrong. Thomas Aquinas, the dean of divinity in Paris, University of Paris, heard this and got out the hold of this text and played the mediator role. The church is right, but philosophers are also right, the classic mediator. So he found a way. So if you go to the Vatican today, you go to the fresco of Raphael, my favorite, all-time favorite artist in the world, you'll see that you have Plato, Academy of Athens. You have Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, of course, in the center, but even Rushd is there. Because the Europeans revere him for having brought back the classical knowledge. Some of the texts of Aristotle and Greek survived only in Arabic translation. Metaphysics, for example, the first knowledge of modern Europe of metaphysics came in Arabic translation. Later, they found a text from the Byzantine Empire. So what I'm saying is that this is what excited me. It's like a detective novel. For me, this is detective. Where did this come from? How did the Jesuits brought Chinese civil service exams to Europe through France? How did the British India Company recruited its civil servants to open examination? Because in the medieval period, if you know the medieval history, the French, like Voltaire, wanted to get rid of the ancient regime and create a more republic. Now, how do you get rid of, by killing the king is not enough if the bureaucracy is still there. So the king is the head, the bureaucracy is the body. So Voltaire and others thought, we need to change the civil service, because if you want to have a civil servant in the old days, where do you go? You go to the nobility. You recruit the children, basically male children. Nothing changes. The king might die, may be beheaded, but the system lives on. So they thought that we need to recruit civil servants through open competitive exam. Where do you get this? You get this from China. So the Jesuits passed this to China, the British East India Company, to their office in Canton, Guangzhou. They passed it to India, and that came to Britain. Britain got it, France got it, then Americans got it. Americans were very nervous. The China, authoritarian, how can we learn anything from China? But then the American Civil Service Commission in 1874 said, if the British can learn from China, why can't we? Because we got so many things from Britain, so they must be okay. So these narratives are all there, and this is a detective story. This history is a history of detective story, travelogue, art history, a lot of archaeology. I'm not an expert on everything, but I spent an enormous amount of time building up these narratives and triangulating them, finding sources, of course, cost and research assistance from students. I taught this class for 12 years before I wrote this book called Civilizations and World Order. So it's a passion. You cannot write a book. And I get criticized for it, because every day there is somebody said, oh, it's wrong, that is wrong. By the way, thank you for reminding me. There is a review of this book in Current History, which says this book is based on newspaper and magazine articles. And I read this, and I wrote to the editor, the less than 7% of a 474 pages of book are from magazine articles or newspaper articles. And these are like New York Times, BBC, and others. So I sent this to the editor. So the editor said, this is nonsense, because the people want to basically disagree with you, and they find all kinds of excuses. This is based a lot on very credible, authentic sources, often triangulated. There were 3 times the footnotes of we have now, but the editors, this is a commercial press that decided to cut the footnotes. But all the footnotes are preserved in a separate file, and I can back up almost every single claim I make in this book.
Last question, but
yes,
be very brief, please, because we are out of time.
Well, I very much sympathize with the historical approach to civilization and to what the West is. But it is a fluid concept, the West. And this is, I am asking this because you are speaking all the time of the moment. Now, at this moment, I think that my question is, who is the West, not what is the West? Who is the West at this moment? And this is a very controversial point, because is Bolivia part of the West? Is Turkey part of the West? Is Japan part of the West? Is North Korea part of the West? Is Israel part of the West? So we have a lot of border cases, and I would like you to make the effort to define at this moment what is the West in terms of who is the West, but what is the West. For me, for a long time, it was OECD membership. It has stopped to be like this because the OECD wants to incorporate Thailand and countries that we don't think are the West normally. So the question is, if it is not the OECD membership, what is the West? Who is in the West?
All right, there's a book, several books have been written about what is the West. But in my book, I deal with this in a couple of chapters. And I think the whole idea, like every region is arbitrary. Like, where is Southeast Asia? Where is Asia, by the way? The definition of Asia changes by the day. Now, yesterday was Asia, then East Asia, Asia Pacific, now Indo-Pacific. So it's a very politically constructed term. And the West is also politically constructed. It still has consequence, but nonetheless, there's nothing permanent about it. Now, today depends on who you ask. So recently, the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Haskett had a meeting with Latin American leaders, like-minded. He said, we are part of the same civilization, Christian Western civilization. Okay, so that means those who are not invited there are not part of the Western civilization. And then you have J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the US, coming to say, you have lost your values. Your civilizational erasure, right? Where civilization, Western civilization began. So America now thinks they are defenders of the West. Trump came to Poland in 2016, just after he was elected, 2017, and said we must defend West. But he has done most to destroy the idea of the West. Nobody has done more. What Brezhnev and Stalin failed to do over the Cold War, Trump has succeeded in doing. So destroyed the idea of the West. So it depends on who you ask. I really think, like all concepts, all regions, it's a question of perception and political discourse. And I do think that in the discursive realm, there is an idea of the West, because it's been backed up by a lot of writing, a lot of literature. But that doesn't mean we have to keep it like that, because it's divisive. The West is a very divisive notion. The rest is a very divisive notion. And I'm not a proponent of Global South, as you know. I think it's good to have it up to a point, but it's not meaningful. Anymore. It's less meaningful than the West, by the way. It's much bigger. We started with 50 countries, now we have 150 countries in the non-aligned movement or so. And so I think we should not think in terms of absolute categories, as if they're fixed and permanent. There are terms of convenience, but every time I write a book, people say, oh, you're talking about West versus the rest. Despite, no matter how many times I say that I don't believe it, it's a term of convenience. You cannot engage your critics or audience without using some other terms, but you don't have to accept it. So I think if you ask me a simple, blunt answer, today only Western Europe is part of the West. That is the West. It's Western, right? To the extent the question is meaningful, but I think in terms of the values you associate with the West, rightly or wrongly, you're likely to find them more in Western Europe, in the European Union. But of course, we have some new members, and we had a change in Hungary. But Hungarian people obviously wanted to be part of the West. But I think the more we belabor these concepts, the more divisions we create. And the less unity or inclusiveness, unity is not the right word, we will have. And if you get over that, then we may find new ways of thinking about cooperation. And this cooperation across civilizations, across the West and the rest, to me is the way to go. At a time when the global world order is under attack from the biggest champion of the West, the United States, is the biggest threat to the idea of the West.
Well, definitely we all have to buy and read this book to understand what's going on and what's happening in this transition. Thank you very much for your work. Thank you very much, Inés, as well. And we are now going to hear Paul Morillas, the director of CIDOB, who has some remarks, closing remarks.
But thank you very much, Professor, for accepting the invitation to follow up on the discussions that we had in the War and Peace Conference. And I see familiar faces also who took part in the conference on Saturday. And I just wanted to say this is the last event of the War and Peace Week that we dedicated to the War and Peace Conference taking place on Saturday, but with a series of activities. We started with the Chief Executive of the European Defence Agency. We organized an activity here and a series of meetings. Then we followed up with the conference taking place in ESADE, in ESADE Business School, discussing some of the topics. Then we followed up with the conference itself on Saturday, and now we're finishing with this activity. It's been intense, but very rewarding, and I would like to thank you for your participation on Saturday and today, and also for this particular occasion. Of course, I would like to thank World in Progress initiative of PRISA, who has been grateful enough, and of course, Lluís Pellicer as moderator of this roundtable, to join forces and organize together this event, and of course, also to Inés Arco, a researcher here. A pleasure to have heard you, and it's been extremely rewarding. So thank you very much for coming to this or to any other event of the War and Peace Week that you have participated in. So thank you.
Sure.